It started with silence, the kind that makes even the cameras hold their breath. One question, 15 words, that's all it took to turn the most powerful man in Britain into the most humiliated politician in Westminster. Because 15 minutes ago, inside Parliament, the Prime Minister's career didn't just stumble, it was executed. Publicly, surgically, and without a single raised voice. No chaos, no shouting, no theatrics. Just one MP armed with facts, documents, and timing so lethal it could have been written by a screenwriter. And what followed will go down as one of the most devastating political takedowns in modern British history. Inside the House of Commons, the Prime Minister sat calm at first. Too calm, almost rehearsed, as if he knew what was coming but thought he could charm his way through it. But the problem with charm is that it only works when people still trust you. And trust was the one thing this government had already burned through months ago. The opposition benches were packed. The atmosphere, electric, dangerous, like the moment before a storm hits. Then came the first question, simple, sharp, and impossible to dodge. Can the Prime Minister explain why evidence in a national security case was withheld from prosecutors under his government's watch? Every MP turned. The Prime Minister blinked. And that's when the unravelling began. He started with the usual, polished words, vague phrases, the same political wallpaper he's used 100 times before. We acted on the advice provided. The process followed due procedure. Lessons will be learned. But what he didn't realise was that this time, his usual dance around accountability wouldn't save him. Because sitting across from him was not an opponent looking for a headline, but it was a former ally looking for justice, armed with receipts that would tear his story apart piece by piece. Due procedure, she repeated, holding up a printed timeline, because according to this, your government had the evidence. You had it! You just never sent it! The room shifted. A low murmur echoed through the benches. The speaker tried to calm the noise, but the damage was already done. The Prime Minister, suddenly aware that the cameras were catching every blink, tried to reframe the story, insisting that technical oversights were to blame. Technical oversights? On a spy case involving foreign infiltration of British MPs. The excuse was so absurd it almost sounded like satire. That's when the second blow landed. So just to be clear, she pressed, you're saying national security failed because of a clerical error? A typo, perhaps? Laughter rippled across the chamber. Sharp, unkind laughter. The kind that tells you the crowd has picked a side and it's not yours. The Prime Minister shifted again, fumbling his notes, eyes darting between advisers who suddenly looked like they wanted to vanish into their seats. Because everyone knew what came next. This wasn't just a bad day. This was the day the narrative flipped. The day a leader became a liability. And then she dropped her first real weapon, a document marked confidential, dated months before the trial collapse. This memo, she said, holding it up so the cameras could see, proves that your office was warned, repeatedly, that withholding evidence could compromise the entire prosecution. You were told, and you ignored it. The chamber froze. For a few seconds, the only sound was the paper trembling slightly in her hand. The Prime Minister opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. That's the thing about power. It never ends with a crash, it ends with violence. And that silence was deafening. But she wasn't done, not even close. She leaned forward, voice calm, almost polite, and asked, Prime Minister, were you aware of this memo, or do you expect us to believe that the most important case in British intelligence history simply slipped through your inbox? The question hit like a hammer. It wasn't just a jab, it was a trap, because whichever way he answered, he'd lose. Admit ignorance and he's incompetent. Admit knowledge and he's complicit. The Prime Minister paused, then offered the weakest defence imaginable. I can't comment on ongoing national security matters. It was over. The room erupted. MPs shouted, some cheering, others shaking their heads. Cameras zoomed in on his face, drained, defeated, a man realising too late that words can't cover up what's already been exposed. And in that moment, the MP who started it all, calm, collected, unmoved, simply nodded and sat down. 15 minutes, that's all it took. But what came after would make the fall look almost gentle, because the next revelation would drag Downing Street itself into the storm. Cliffhanger. So if this was just the opening act, what happens when the documents she's holding finally go public? The moment the Speaker called for order, it was already too late. The damage had spread far beyond the green benches. Every journalist in the press gallery was typing furiously. Every camera light was fixed on the Prime Minister, and every whisper in the room carried the same word: cover up. What happened next didn't feel like parliamentary debate anymore. It felt like a slow motion implosion of authority. The Prime Minister straightened his notes, took a deep breath and tried to regain composure, pretending control he no longer had. He spoke of complex legal frameworks, of evolving evidence standards, of cross-departmental coordination failures. But every phrase only made him sound more detached, more robotic, more like a man defending a system rather than leading a country. Each word drained credibility instead of restoring it. Across the aisle, his challenger waited, unflinching, her expression unreadable, but her timing flawless. She didn't interrupt, didn't smirk, didn't even look triumphant. She simply waited until he finished burying himself under bureaucratic jargon, then quietly struck again. So what you're saying, Prime Minister, she began, is that your own departments failed to deliver key evidence. The prosecution collapsed, and somehow no one is responsible, not the ministers, not the advisors, not you. The chamber tensed. MPS leaned forward. It wasn't shouting that made this moment powerful. It was precision. She was dissecting excuses like a surgeon, cutting through tissue, and a clean, deliberate final. The Prime Minister tried to counter with deflection. He pointed toward the opposition, reminding everyone that the previous administration had initiated the investigation. He said, "Let us not forget who first mishandled this case," as if history could save him. But the room wasn't buying it, because she was ready again, armed with a new set of quotes, not opinions. His own words from just months earlier. She read them aloud slowly, each one sharper than the last. His assurance that the government will show full transparency, his vow to personally oversee all national security matters, and his promise that Britain's safety will never be compromised under my watch. Then she looked up and asked the one question that turned murmurs into gasps. Where was that personal oversight when national security was compromised under your government's watch? The silence afterward was thick enough to touch. Even his allies stopped nodding. Every political survival instinct told him to stay calm, to look confident, but his hands betrayed him. They trembled slightly as he turned a page he wasn't really reading. He muttered something about context, but no one cared about context anymore. Context doesn't erase failure. Context doesn't bring back trust. Context doesn't explain why a Prime Minister looks like he's learning the details of his own scandal in real time. Meanwhile, the story was already spreading beyond those walls. Phones buzzed across the chamber with notifications from news outlets. Breaking, PM grilled over Sapie case cover-up. Social media feeds flooded with clips of his blank stare and her piercing question. The hashtags were brutal, the edits merciless. Even broadcasters that once defended him began to shift tone, calling it a defining moment of political accountability. For years, this man had controlled the narrative. Now the narrative was eating him alive. And yet he still tried to salvage dignity. He announced that an internal inquiry would be launched to ensure complete transparency. The irony was unbearable, the very word. Transparency echoed like a joke in bad taste. The opposition benches erupted again, some MPs laughing openly. The Speaker demanded decorum, but the authority of the chair couldn't hide what was unfolding. This wasn't about governance anymore. This was about exposure. The mask of confidence had slipped, and beneath it was panic. Quiet, suffocating panic. The challenger rose once more, her voice measured, her delivery surgical. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. An inquiry, she asked. Into what, Prime Minister? Your own inaction? Your own decision to ignore evidence, or perhaps into how national security became a footnote in your political strategy? Each question tightened the noose. The Prime Minister offered a practiced smile, but his eyes betrayed fatigue. The look of a man realising that survival now depends on delay. And then the real bomb dropped. She read a line from another classified document, one mentioning a meeting between senior advisors and a Chinese intermediary weeks before the trial collapsed. The Prime Minister froze. It was the first genuine shock of the session. His face strained, his jaw tightened. Perhaps the Prime Minister could clarify who attended this meeting, she continued, and whether the decision to drop the charges was made before or after it took place. The Speaker called for order again, but the damage was done. The story had just evolved from incompetence to possible interference, from mismanagement to something far darker. The Prime Minister's aides exchanged panicked glances, the opposition benches roared with demands for an answer, and the media gallery buzzed like a swarm of hornets. He tried to respond but stumbled over his words, the once smooth tone of authority replaced with hesitation. By the time the Speaker suspended the session for recess, the headlines were already forming, and every word spelled danger. The Prime Minister had walked into Parliament expecting a debate. What he got instead was an indictment written in real time, televised for the nation. Cliffhanger. And if that meeting really happened, and if proof exists, then the question isn't just whether he loses his job, but whether he ever walks free again. When Parliament reconvened, the atmosphere was no longer tense, it was explosive. The Prime Minister walked back into the chamber with his jaw clenched, his face pale, the weight of the last hour pressing on his shoulders. The once controlled leader now looked like a man walking into his own trial. Behind him, party whips whispered frantically, trying to hold together what was clearly fracturing. Across from him, the challenger waited, papers still in hand, the expression on her face calm but unyielding. Every camera in the room locked on her, every journalist ready to broadcast what would come next. The Speaker called for order, but everyone knew there was no order left to salvage. This wasn't just another session. This was history in motion. The Prime Minister began with a statement that was meant to steady the ship, but instead poured gasoline on the fire. He admitted that the meeting in question did occur, but insisted it was routine and had no bearing on the prosecution process. The words hit the air like sparks, and within seconds, the opposition benches erupted in disbelief. Routine? A secret meeting with intermediaries connected to the same nation accused of espionage was routine? Even his own MPS began to shift uncomfortably. You could see it in their eyes. The realisation that this might not be survivable because once the word interference enters the political bloodstream, there's no antidote. The challenger rose slowly, a faint smile on her lips. So the meeting happened, she said, her tone low, deliberate, almost sympathetic, the way a prosecutor might speak to a defendant who's just confessed without realising it. Then perhaps the Prime Minister can tell the House who authorised it. The question landed like a blade. He tried to pivot, talking about diplomatic communication channels, about cross-border dialogue, about maintaining stability, but every word only deepened the pit. It sounded rehearsed, evasive, hollow, because everyone watching knew that if the meeting was harmless, it wouldn't have been secret. That's when she revealed the next layer. Emails leaked from within the Cabinet Office itself, time-stamped just days before the case collapsed. The contents were chillingly clear. Urgent discussion regarding security implications of prosecution. The implication was undeniable. Someone had pulled strings, and those strings led straight to Downing Street. The chamber went silent again. That heavy, suffocating silence that always follows revelation. The Prime Minister tried to speak, but the Speaker had to call for order 3 times before his voice could even be heard over the uproar. He denied involvement. He denied knowledge. He denied authorisation. But denial without evidence is confession in disguise. His opponents knew it. The press knew it. And perhaps worst of all, his own party knew it. One of his senior ministers exchanged a brief glance with the challenger, an unspoken acknowledgement that the tide had turned. Loyalty in politics lasts only as long as survival, and in that moment, survival meant distance. Outside Westminster, the news cycle had exploded. Networks were broadcasting live updates every 5 minutes. Analysts were already using words like resignation, impeachment, and criminal liability. Social media was merciless. The clip of the Prime Minister admitting the meeting had already crossed 1 million views. Memes, hashtags, headlines. His entire defence strategy was collapsing faster than his approval rating. For a man who built his image on control, this was the ultimate irony. Watching his downfall unfold on one frame at a time on the very screens he once dominated. Back inside the chamber, the opposition pressed harder. The challenger's voice remained calm, almost gentle, but her words were surgical. "Prime Minister," she said, "if you were not involved, if you did not authorise this meeting, and if you claim no knowledge of withheld evidence, then who is running this government?" The question didn't just expose incompetence. It suggested something far worse. Loss of control. The kind of question that changes headlines from government under fire to government in collapse. The Prime Minister's attempt to answer came out fractured, defensive, and laced with irritation. This government remains fully functional, he insisted, and will not be distracted by conspiracy theories. But his tone betrayed him. There was fear underneath. That quiet tremor only heard when power begins to slip through your fingers. He tried to pivot again, to talk about stability, progress, unity, but nobody was listening. The room was no longer a debate hall. It was an autopsy theatre, and he was the subject. One MP on his own side stood up not to defend him, but to demand clarification. That was the final sign of disintegration, when your allies start using the same language as your enemies. The Prime Minister's face went blank for a moment, the realisation setting in that this wasn't about damage control anymore. This was survival. But even survival was slipping away. As the session drew to a close, the challenger delivered one final line. Quiet, deliberate, and unforgettable. "If the Prime Minister won't tell us who made that decision," she said, "then maybe it's time the country finds out without him." The words landed like a verdict. The speaker's gavel came down, but no one was listening anymore. The story had already escaped the chamber, spreading like wildfire beyond those historic walls. The Prime Minister gathered his papers slowly, expression blank, movements robotic. Cameras followed him as he left the chamber, shoulders heavy, his entourage silent. It wasn't the walk of a leader. It was the walk of a man leaving the scene of his own undoing. Cliffhanger. But as he stepped into the hallway, one reporter shouted a question that froze him mid-step. A question about a name found in those leaked emails. And if that name turns out to be who insiders suspect, this scandal won't just end a career. It could bring down an entire government. The corridors of Westminster had never felt so suffocating. Reporters were everywhere, microphones shoved toward every cabinet member, flashes of cameras catching every twitch of discomfort. The Prime Minister didn't speak. He couldn't. His advisors swarmed around him like panicked bees, whispering damage control strategies that sounded hollow, even to their own ears. Outside, the noise of protesters grew louder. Chants echoing through the streets, demanding resignation, demanding truth, demanding accountability. It was no longer a political crisis, it was a full-blown national reckoning. Inside number 10, the scene was chaos disguised as calm. Aides typed frantically, drafting statements that contradicted each other every hour. Ministers called, some offering support, others politely distancing themselves. The Prime Minister sat in silence, staring at the headlines splashed across every screen. Leaked emails linked Downing Street to spy case collapse. The name the reporter had shouted, the one he thought no one would ever know, was already trending worldwide. It was the name of his own national security advisor, the man who had been in that routine meeting with Chinese intermediaries. And the emails made one thing painfully clear. The Prime Minister knew. He had been copied on the correspondence. He had approved the discussion. The paper trail was undeniable. What followed wasn't a political debate, it was a countdown. The opposition moved swiftly, calling for an emergency investigation, demanding his immediate suspension. Senior members of his own party began holding private meetings, discussing leadership contingency. That was the euphemism used in Westminster when a government is preparing to remove its own head. Even the loyal newspapers, the ones that once painted him as untouchable, began to shift tone, questioning his integrity. Overnight, the image of strength and stability had dissolved into one of deception and weakness. The Prime Minister finally addressed the nation the next morning, standing at the same podium where he had once promised reform and renewal. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed exhaustion. He denied wrongdoing, insisted he acted in the national interest, and condemned what he called a campaign of misinformation. But no one believed him, because the public had already seen the evidence, the leaked documents, the quotes, the memos stamped with his approval. The moment he finished speaking, journalists began shouting questions he refused to answer. The broadcast ended, but the fallout didn't. Within minutes, opposition leaders had issued statements calling for his resignation. Even neutral commentators began using a word that had never before been linked to his name: corruption. In Parliament, the challenger who started it all rose once more. She didn't glow, she didn't celebrate, she simply stated what everyone already knew. The Prime Minister has lost the confidence of this House and, more importantly, the confidence of this country. The Speaker's gavel struck, but the noise in the chamber drowned it out. MPs shouting, papers flying, the chaos of history being written in real time. Across the country, televisions flickered with live coverage of a government collapsing under its own deceit. Within hours, Downing Street released a carefully worded statement. The Prime Minister will be stepping aside pending the outcome of the investigation. But it fooled no one. Everyone knew this wasn't a temporary leave. It was an exit disguised as procedure. Cabinet ministers began submitting resignations one by one, and the fragile illusion of authority evaporated completely. The man who once ruled with confidence and charisma now sat alone in his office, surrounded by silence and resignation letters. By evening, the resignation was official. The Prime Minister stepped outside number 10 for the last time, cameras flashing like gunfire. His voice trembled as he thanked his family, his staff and the country for the honour of service. But there was no applause, no cheer, just the echo of his words against the cold London air. As his car pulled away, the crowd outside jeered, their chants of "resign" turning into a deafening chorus of "justice." And yet, even as he disappeared from view, one truth remained: this story wasn't over. Because the investigation that had begun as a parliamentary scandal had now expanded into something far greater, the Intelligence Committee had confirmed that evidence was deliberately withheld. Legal authorities were involved, arrests were rumoured, and somewhere deep inside Whitehall, officials were scrambling to contain a crisis that no longer could be contained. The challenger, meanwhile, became an overnight symbol of integrity. The MP who brought down a Prime Minister without shouting, without spectacle, using nothing but truth. Her closing words in Parliament went viral within hours, shared millions of times. Leadership isn't about power, it's about responsibility. And when responsibility is abandoned, removal isn't rebellion, it's justice. But as the cameras faded and Britain tried to process what had just happened, new whispers began to emerge. Whispers about who leaked those emails, who orchestrated the timing, and whether this takedown was part of something much larger than anyone realised, because if the Prime Minister's fall was only the first domino, the next one could shake the entire establishment. Cliffhanger. So the real question now isn't who ended his career, it's who planned it. And if that answer ever comes out, Britain may discover that the real scandal was never the cover-up, it was the conspiracy behind it.